Part 1, what they thought they took from her. In the spring of 1893, a property manager named Walter Crane walked the northern edge of the Pershing grainland outside Greystone, Missouri, checking fence posts and drainage the way men like him always did, with boots that knew mud and a notebook that knew nothing but facts. He was not a curious man by nature. He was a practical one, and practical men do not linger on things that do not require their attention. But Walter Crane lingered. He had come to the ravine because the survey notes described it as non-arable drainage, which meant it was not his problem, which meant he had intended to note its existence and move on. Instead, he stood at the rim and looked down into the limestone cut and saw something that his notebook had no category for. On the east wall of the ravine, tucked beneath an overhang of solid rock that extended from the cliff face like a ceiling built before anyone had a word for ceiling, there was a section of dry stacked limestone running 18 feet across the opening. The stones were fitted so closely together, each face chosen and seated against the next, with a precision that did not belong to geology, that for a long moment Walter Crane thought he was looking at a natural formation. A trick of the rock, a coincidence of erosion. Then he saw the doorway. Two flat-faced stones set on end framing an opening just wide enough for a person to pass through, and above it a gap of 2 feet between the top of the wall and the rock ceiling above, open to light and air and whatever wind came down the ravine from the north. Walter Crane stood at the rim for a while. He looked at the wall. He looked at the overhang. He looked at the creek running clear and low along the ravine floor below, and at the pale, thick roots of bur oak threading down through the east wall like the fingers of something very old and very patient. He climbed down. He put his hand against the stone. It did not move. It had not moved, he understood, in a very long time. The joints between each course were tight as a whisper. Moss had started its slow work on the surface. The doorway gap behind the standing stones showed the dark rectangle of a canvas panel, weather-stained and still. He stood there for a few minutes more. The creek ran past. A bird called from somewhere above the rim and was answered by nothing. Then Walter Crane opened his notebook and wrote in the careful hand of a man who trusted facts and distrusted mystery the following possible old livestock shelter. Conditions stable. No action required. He closed the notebook, climbed back up the ravine wall, and went on with his day. He never went back. And for 11 years, neither did anyone else. What Walter Crane did not know, what no one in Greystone, Missouri would ever fully know, was that the wall he had found was not a livestock shelter. It was not old. It was not abandoned in the way abandoned things usually are left by people who had moved on or given up or run out of time. It had been built deliberately and precisely and secretly by a 28-year-old woman named Cora Hext, who had built it with a carpenter's adze and $41, and the kind of knowledge that people absorb without knowing they are absorbing it through years of watching someone who understood how the world was actually held together. She had built it in 14 days in the autumn of 1889, on land that did not belong to her, 80 feet from the fence line of the family that had just told her she had 3 days to leave and a horse for the road and nothing else. She had not gone. She had gone 80 feet. This is the story of what she built there and what it cost her to build it and what she learned inside it and what she left behind when she finally walked out on a Thursday morning in March of 1893, 4 years and 5 months after she had first climbed down. And it begins as most true stories begin, not with a dramatic moment, but with a long and ordinary accumulation of small ones. It begins in the spring of 1885, when Cora Hext was 24 years old and not yet anyone's wife in a town 60 miles south of Greystone, where her father built things that lasted. James Hext was a carpenter of the old school, which meant he had no patience for shortcuts and no tolerance for joints that fit almost right. He was a quiet man in the way that men who work with their hands are often quiet, not from lack of thought, but from a preference for doing oversaying for showing overtelling. His shop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and the particular dry warmth of wood shavings in winter, and Cora had grown up inside that smell the way other children grow up inside music or the sound of their mother's voice. What James Hext taught his daughter, he taught without teaching. He walked a foundation before he poured it. He measured a board 3 times before he cut it once. He pressed his palm flat against a wall to feel whether what was behind it was solid or hollow, because he had learned that the difference between those two things is not always visible from the outside, and that a person who cannot tell the difference has no business building anything meant to last. Cora watched all of this. She filed it away without knowing she was filing it. She was 24 when she married Owen Hargrove, and the knowledge she carried with her into that marriage was not the kind that announces itself. It was the quiet kind, the kind that waits. The Hargrove family had farmed river bottomland outside Greystone for 2 generations. 40 acres of good Missouri soil that the Hargrove name had sat on since before the territory became a state worked and inherited, and held the way some families hold land, not as property exactly, but as identity. The Hargroves did not simply own their land. They were their land, or believed themselves to be, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms. Douglas Hargrove was 65 years old in 1885, a broad-shouldered man gone to stiffness at the joints with the deliberate movements of someone who has been a physical authority his whole life and has not yet adjusted to the body's quiet rebellion. He ran the farm the way he ran everything, which was absolutely and without consultation, and he had raised his son Owen in the understanding that the Hargrove land was the first and last consideration of every decision that mattered. Owen was 31. He was not a cruel man. This is important to understand because the story of what happened to Cora Hext is not the story of a cruel man. It is the story of a weak one, which is a different thing entirely, and in certain ways a worse one because cruelty at least has a shape you can push against. Weakness has no shape. It simply yields in whatever direction the stronger force is pushing, and Owen Hargrove's strongest force had always been his father. The wedding was in April. It was not a large affair. The Hargroves received the guests with the particular hospitality of people who are doing someone a favor by allowing the celebration to happen on their property, and the guests understood this and behaved accordingly, which is to say they ate the food and complimented the farm and went home before dark. James Hext gave his daughter the adze. It had been his for 20 years. The handle was worn smooth at the grip, shaped by his palm to a fit that belonged to him, and he had kept the blade sharp with the obsessive regularity of a man who understood that a dull tool is an insult to the wood and a danger to the carpenter. He had wrapped it in oilcloth for the occasion and tied it with a piece of twine, and he handed it to Cora in the morning before the guests arrived, not as a ceremony, but as a simple transfer of something that needed to be transferred. He said, "You know how to use it." She did. The Hargroves received the adze with a politeness that had been carefully calibrated to communicate without stating directly that they did not consider a hand tool an appropriate wedding gift and that whatever they thought of the Hex family's understanding of appropriate celebrations, they were too well-bred to say so in front of the bride. Douglas Hargrove looked at the oilcloth bundle with the expression of a man looking at something that has been placed in the wrong room, and Owen said thank you with the tone of a man who is saying something else entirely. Cora noticed. She had been noticing things since before she could name what noticing was, and she filed this one away with the careful efficiency of someone who has learned that information is always more useful than reaction. The adze went into the barn. It hung on a peg near the door, and no one touched it, and no one mentioned it again, and Cora looked at it every time she passed through the barn for 4 years, and she thought about her father's hands on the handle, and she kept her thoughts to herself. This was the beginning of her education in the Hargrove household, and the lesson was simple. What you can do does not matter here as much as what you are, and what you are is what we say you are. And right now we say you are a wife who has not yet proven her worth in the only way that matters to us. The first year Cora built the kitchen garden, it had been a patch of hard clay and perennial weeds when she arrived, the kind of ground that discourages the casual gardener and rewards only the one who is willing to understand it before trying to change it. Cora spent the first winter composting and observing, walking the plot through every weather, noting where the water sat in after rain and where it drained, mapping the path of sunlight across the beds through each season, because sun and drainage are the two things you cannot argue with in a garden, and the two things that every failed garden has gotten wrong. By the second spring, the beds were producing. By that summer, they were feeding the household and filling the root cellar beyond what the Hargroves had ever stored from a kitchen garden in one season. Douglas Hargrove walked past the garden one afternoon in August. He stopped. He looked at the rows with the eyes of a man accustomed to evaluating productive things. Then he said to no one in particular, and to Cora in specific, "This one knows how to work." His voice carried the tone of a man inspecting a new piece of equipment and finding it satisfactory. Cora was on her knees in the east bed, thinning carrots, and she heard the distinction between praising the work and praising the worker. And she pressed her palm flat against the soil the way her father had taught her to press his palm against a wall, and she felt what was beneath her, and she filed Douglas Hargrove's voice away in the same place she kept everything else that needed to be kept. She did not say anything. She was not ready yet to trust her own instincts about the Hargroves, and she still believed in that first year that proving herself useful and being valued were the same thing. She would need 4 years to understand exactly where that error lay. The second year, Cora began to know the Hargrove land better than Owen did. This was not something she pursued. It was something that happened as a consequence of the way she moved through the world, which was slowly and with attention the way her father moved through a job site before picking up a tool. She learned which spring ran cold in August when the others warmed. She learned where the soil shifted from clay to loam at the 3-foot mark along the west field, the invisible line between ground that would yield and ground that would resist. She learned the drainage patterns after heavy rain, the way water collected in the low corner of the east pasture, and sat there for days if no one cut a channel, turning good grass to standing mud and standing mud to root rot. Owen did not know these things. Owen moved through the farm the way a man moves through a space he owns, but does not inhabit quickly and with purpose, directed outward toward the fence lines and the market price of grain and the business of being a Hargrove in a county where being a Hargrove still meant something. He was not incurious exactly. He simply had never learned to be still long enough for the land to tell him what it knew. And this difference, which Cora observed without comment, was the second piece of her education. What Owen knew and what he discussed with his father on the porch in the evenings while Cora washed dishes in the kitchen, with the window left open in the summer heat, was that Cora had not conceived. She heard this conversation 3 times in the second year before she stopped counting. The Hargrove men were not deliberately cruel about it. They spoke about it the way they spoke about the farm, with a practical concern for outcomes, as if Cora's body were a field that had not yet produced, and the question was whether it ever would. The third time, Owen said it plainly in a voice flattened by repetition into something that had lost whatever discomfort it might once have carried. She knows the dirt, but she does not know how to be a mother. Cora was standing at the sink with a dish towel in her hand. She did not move. She did not move for a long time. The water in the basin went from warm to cool to cold. She wrung out the towel. She hung it on the hook. She went to bed. She did not mention what she had heard because there was nothing to mention. A thing overheard is not a conversation, it is information. And information Cora Hex had learned before she could articulate the lesson is always more useful than the emotion it produces if you give it time to become something other than a wound. She gave it time. The third year she began taking in sewing through the side door of the Hargrove farmhouse, quietly, without telling Owen or Douglas or anyone in the household. 3 women in Greystone found her through the particular network that women use to find good work, which is by asking each other which is the way women have always found most things worth finding. Cora's work was not fast and it was not decorative. What it was work that held, seams that did not pull, buttonholes that did not fray, hems that fell level after 50 washings because Cora had learned from her mother, who had learned from her own mother the technique of stitching twice before cutting, which added 20 minutes to every hem, and was the reason Cora charged what she charged and the reason her customers paid it without complaint. She was paid in cash. The cash went into the lining of her winter coat. The winter coat hung on a hook in the bedroom closet where nobody looked because nobody had reason to look, because money that a woman earns with her own hands in a household where she is considered an instrument of the household is money that belongs entirely to her, only if she has the sense not to mention it. And Cora had that sense. She had learned by the third year of her marriage that keeping things required not telling anyone you had them. The fourth year, Owen moved his things to the spare room. He did not announce this. He simply carried his belongings down the hall one afternoon while Cora was in the garden, and when she walked past the bedroom that evening and saw the single pillow on the bed where there had been 2, she stood in the doorway and waited for what she expected to feel. What arrived was not sadness, it was lightness. She stood there with the light fading outside the window and felt a loosening in her chest that she had not experienced in 4 years of living in a house that had never quite fit the shape of her, and she hated the lightness because it told her something about herself that she was not yet ready to hear. It told her that she had already given up without knowing when the giving up had happened. That somewhere in 4 years of gardens and sewing and overheard conversations and dish towels and cold water in the basin, she had stopped trying in the way she had imagined herself trying, and she could not now identify the moment because either the moment had been too small to notice or she had never been trying in the way she thought she had. Neither answer was comfortable. She closed the bedroom door and went to the kitchen to finish the mending that was due on Friday. It was Nell Briggs who said it out loud. Nell was 55, a widow for 8 years, living alone on 10 acres that bordered the Hargrove land to the west. She had survived her husband's death and the winters alone, and the quiet erosion that happens to women in small towns when they no longer have a man's name attached to their daily business, the way water erodes limestone, not violently but persistently, until the shape of the thing is different from what it started as, and the stone cannot say exactly when it changed. Nell Briggs was not sentimental. She was practical in the way that people become practical when sentiment has cost them more than they can afford. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, and she did not say much, which made the things she did say land harder than most people's speeches. Cora brought a mended shirt to Nell's house on a Tuesday afternoon in that fourth summer. Nell poured tea. They sat on the porch. Nell looked at Cora the way Nell looked at everything, directly and without apology, and she said, "The Hargroves are not going to keep you. They do not keep wives who do not bear children. You should start thinking about what comes next." Cora set her teacup down on the railing of the porch. She was not angry because Nell was wrong. She was angry because Nell was right. And there is a particular fury in being told what you already know by someone who has no obligation to soften it, especially when you have not yet found the courage to say it to yourself. That fury rose in Cora's chest and sat there like a stone she did not know what to do with. She stood up. She said, "Thank you for the tea." She left without another word. She did not visit Nell Briggs again that summer, and she would remember the decision later with the specific regret of a person who punishes honesty because they are not ready for it, who closes the door on the one person telling the truth because the truth in that moment is something you cannot hold without breaking. But she heard it. She filed it. She let it do its work in the part of her mind where things are processed slowly and without ceremony, the way soil processes winter. The rest of that fourth summer passed in the silence of a household where everyone knows what is coming and no one is willing to name it. Cora tended the garden. She mended clothes. She kept her side door business running. 3 customers, Tuesday pickups, Friday deliveries, cash into the coat lining. Owen came in and went out on a schedule she no longer tracked. Douglas sat on the porch in the evenings and watched his fields the way a man watches something he owns and does not quite understand why he owns it, except that his father owned it before him, and the owning had become the reason for the owning. She thought about her father often that summer, not with longing exactly, but with the recognition that James Hext had given her something the Hargroves could not identify and therefore could not take, which was a way of seeing the world that valued what you could do with your hands over what you could claim with your name. Her father measured a board 3 times before he cut it once. He walked a foundation before he poured it. He treated every joint as if it were the one that would bear the weight of the whole structure, because in his experience, it usually was. These habits had entered Cora without announcement, absorbed the way children absorb the things that will matter later through watching, rather than listening, through proximity to competence rather than instruction in it. She had not known standing in her father's shop as a girl, watching him press his palm against a finished wall, to feel whether it was solid that she was learning something she would one day need in a ravine in the Ozark Hills. She only knew that autumn was coming, and that the pillow on her side of the bed had been moved to the spare room, and that Nell Briggs had been right about what was coming, and that being right about a thing does not make the thing hurt less when it arrives. November came, the fourth November of her marriage. Cora was walking the north fence line in the rain, looking for a gap the cattle had been using to push through into the creek pasture. It was a gray afternoon, the kind of Missouri November rain that does not storm, but simply persists, a steady gray curtain of water that soaks everything through without drama and without mercy. The fence ran along the top of a ravine that the Hargroves called the drainage ditch, a name that told you everything about how much attention they had paid to it in the decades they had owned the land beside it. Cora had walked the path above the ravine a dozen times. She knew it ran 600 feet through a limestone cut before opening into the creek below. She knew the walls rose 12 feet on either side. She knew the creek ran clear and cold from springs upstream. What she had not known until that November afternoon was that the overhang on the east wall, at the point where the cut was deepest, was not a ledge. It was a roof. She had gone down into the ravine to check the fence posts at the bottom, and when the rain came harder, she stepped under the overhang and stood there. 20 minutes, the rain falling 6 feet in front of her. The limestone ceiling above her, 8 feet of solid rock extending from the cliff face. The clay bank behind her dry as dust because the overhang had been keeping rain off that bank for longer than anyone alive could calculate. She stood there and looked at it. The ravine walls rose on either side like the walls of a room that had been built by something older than human hands and then forgotten. The clay bank behind her had the texture of pressed earth, dark and fine and dry. The limestone above was ancient and indifferent. The creek below ran soft and low in the November dry season. And Cora Hex, standing in the rain that was not reaching her, pressed her palm flat against the clay bank behind her, the way her father had taught her to press a palm against a wall, and felt what was behind it. Solid, completely solid, and dry. She thought, this is already a room. It simply has not been finished. She did not tell Owen. She was not sure afterward why she had not. Perhaps because the space felt like something she had found for herself, something that had not been given or inherited or assigned. And what Cora found for herself, she had learned over 4 years of marriage to keep quiet about until she knew what she intended to do with it. She intended to do something with it. She went home. She hung her wet coat on the peg by the door. She put water on the stove. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a warm cup, and she thought about the 8 feet of solid limestone above the clay bank and the 18 feet of opening that faced the ravine and the natural doorway that the rock formed at the east end where the overhang began. She thought about her father's ads hanging in the barn on its peg. She thought about the lining of her winter coat. She thought about Nell Briggs on her porch saying you should start thinking about what comes next. And she began to think. She had $41 sewn into the coat lining when the end came. She had been adding to it for 2 years in amounts small enough that no one would notice and consistent enough that she had built without ever deciding she was building it an exit fund. A carpenter's daughter knows how to save against the day when the current job ends and the next one has not yet appeared. The end came on a Thursday morning in early October of 1889. Douglas Hargrove was sitting at the kitchen table when Cora walked in from the garden. Owen was standing by the window with his back to the room looking out at the fields, the way he always looked at the things he was part of but did not wish to face directly. From the hallway behind the kitchen, Cora heard a door close softly, the careful latch click of a woman who knew what was about to happen and had chosen not to be present for it. Owen's mother. Cora noted the sound and filed it in the same place she kept everything else, another piece of evidence that the Hargroves operated by consensus and that the consensus had been reached before she entered the room. Douglas spoke. His voice carried the flat finality of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say enough times that it has lost whatever difficulty it might once have had. The marriage had not taken. Those were his words. Had not taken, as if it were a graft on a fruit tree, a thing that either bonds to the host wood or does not, and if it does not, you cut it clean and move on. The Hargroves were giving her 3 days. They were giving her a horse which was generous by their accounting and which Cora understood immediately as a gesture toward the appearance of decency rather than decency itself. The horse was how they would be able to tell the story later without feeling the weight of what they had done. They kept the house. They kept the barn. They kept the root cellar and the kitchen garden she had spent 4 years building from nothing. They kept the 40 acres of river bottom farmland that the Hargrove name had sat on since before the territory became a state. Douglas said this all plainly in the tone of a man reading a list of facts, because to him, that is what they were. Cora asked one question. What about the garden? Douglas looked at her the way you look at someone who has said something that does not fit the conversation. Then he said, the garden is on Hargrove land. 7 words, 4 years of composting and clearing and planting and mapping sunlight and filling the root cellar and knowing which spring ran cold and which soil ran deep, dismissed in 7 words by a man who had walked past the garden, once said 1 sentence about it, and considered himself qualified to own it. Owen did not turn around. Cora looked at the back of his neck. She would remember this image longer than any other image from her marriage. Not his face, not his hands, not his voice, The back of his neck turned away from her while his father ended her life in this house. It was the posture of a man who has agreed to something he does not have the courage to watch happen, which was the most Owen thing Cora had ever seen him do. And it was the last Owen thing she would ever need to see. She had 3 days. She used them. The first night after Douglas had gone to bed and Owen had retreated to whatever room he was sleeping in. Now Cora walked through the Hargrove house one last time. Slowly and with attention, she touched the kitchen table where she had eaten 1,000 meals without being consulted about any of them. She stood in the doorway of the root cellar and looked at the cans she had filled the beans and tomatoes and pickled beets, her handwriting on the labels, her labor sealed in glass, that would now belong to someone else's winter. She walked out to the garden in the dark and stood among the rows she had built from hard clay. She pressed her palm flat against the soil. Solid, dry, productive, not hers. She went back inside and did not look at the garden again. The first day she took the carpenter's adze from the barn. It had been her father's wedding gift, and therefore it was hers regardless of what any deed in any county courthouse said. She also took a book on farm construction from the shelf in the parlor, a book Douglas had bought years ago and never opened, its spine still stiff and its pages still tight, with the particular newness of information no one had ever used. She packed her sewing kit, her bedroll, and the winter coat with $41 in the lining. And in 3 careful trips made after dark while the household slept, she carried supplies down the ravine path and stored them in the dry space beneath the limestone overhang. The adze. 2 sacks of stone tools she had been collecting from the ravine floor over the previous 2 weeks. Limestone pieces with flat faces and clean edges. A coil of rope, a piece of canvas she had bought in the town the previous month on a pretended errand, rolled tight and wrapped in oilcloth. She did this because a carpenter's daughter does not walk away from a job unprepared. She does not arrive at the foundation without having walked it first. She does not pick up a tool without knowing what she intends to do with it. Cora had known what she intended to do since November of the previous year. The second day she rode into Greystone. She did not buy anything. She walked through the town, slowly observing. She noted the dry goods store run by a man named Earl Voss, a quiet man of about 50, who stood behind his counter the way a fence post stands in a field present and vertical and not inclined to unnecessary conversation. She noted the hours he opened and the rhythm of his customers and the geography of his store, the counter position, the distance from the front window to the back shelf, the sight lines from the street. She was not shopping. She was planning. The third day she rode north past the Hargrove property line, and on her way she passed Nell Briggs's house. She stopped at the gate. Nell came out onto the porch. The 2 women looked at each other across 30 feet of yard and across the distance of the summer, which was a longer distance than 30 feet, the distance between 2 people who had said everything that mattered and still had one thing left. Nell said, "Do you know where you are going?" Cora said, "I do." Nell nodded. Cora rode on. She did not dismount. She did not explain. And Nell Briggs, standing on her porch with the October morning cold and bright around her, watched Cora ride north. Not south toward the county line, not east toward Springfield, north deeper into the Hargrove property toward the tree line in the ravine beyond it. Nell noted this. She noted it the way she noted everything, which was quietly and completely. And she did not mention it to anyone because Nell Briggs understood that some things you see are not yours to speak about. Cora tied the horse above the ravine rim and climbed down. The overhang was as she remembered it. 8 feet of horizontal rock extending from the east wall, running 18 feet along the cut before the ceiling dropped and the space narrowed. The clay bank behind it was drawing. The creek below ran clear and low in the October dry season, 4 feet wide, 6 inches deep at the center, cold from the springs upstream, the color of glass over pale stone. She stood under the overhang with her hands on her hips and looked at it the way she had looked at it in November. Not as a shelter, as a project. The front wall was the first problem. Without a front wall, the space was open to wind from the west, invisible from the ravine path. She needed a wall that would close the opening while leaving room for light and air at the top, and she needed to build it from what the ravine provided because she had $41, and she intended to spend as little as possible until she understood what winter would require. The ravine floor was limestone rubble. She had the adze. She had the flat-faced stones she had stored beneath the overhang over the previous 2 weeks. She had the book she had taken from the Hargrove parlor with its chapters on dry stack construction and its diagrams of courses and keystones and the principles of load distribution without mortar. And she had something the book did not mention, but that her father had taught her more thoroughly than any text could, the understanding that a structure is only as strong as the honesty of the judgment that chose each piece. She spent the first 3 days cutting and fitting stone, each piece chosen for its flat faces and seated against the necks, with nothing to hold it but gravity and the accuracy of her eye. She pressed each course before laying the next testing for a wobble, rejecting any stone that did not sit true. The wall rose across the 18-foot opening in patient courses, each one a little higher than the last, each one a little more deliberate. On the second day of building, she heard hoofbeats above the ravine. She was fitting a stone on the third course when the sound came, and she moved without thinking, dropping flat against the east wall and pressing herself back into the limestone and holding her breath. The hoofbeats came along the rim road, slow and steady, a single rider on the property road. They passed directly above her. Then they stopped. Silence. Cora could hear her own pulse. She could hear the creak. She could hear very faintly the sound of a horse shifting its weight on packed dirt, and then the small sounds a horse makes when it is uneasy, a breath, a movement, hooves adjusting on the ground. The horse had sensed something. The rider had not. The hoofbeats resumed after a long moment, slow moving away, diminishing, gone. Cora lay against the wall for 15 minutes after the sound disappeared. She did not try to stop her hands from shaking because she understood that what she was feeling was not fear, but information, and information deserved to be felt clearly before it could be used. The lesson was this: building a shelter in a ravine on someone else's land was one problem. Keeping that shelter invisible was a different problem entirely. And the second problem would govern every decision she made from this moment forward. She could build the most perfect room in the Ozark Hills. It would mean nothing if a rider on the property road looked down at the wrong moment and saw fresh stonework where there should have been nothing but rubble and root. She waited until the light was failing before she went back to work. The wall rose across the 18-foot opening in 5 courses. She chose every stone not only for its structural quality, but for its appearance, its color, its surface texture, the way it would look from above in failing light or from the ravine path in good morning light. She left the top 2 feet open under the rock ceiling for light and ventilation. She left a doorway space framed by 2 flat-faced stones set on end, wide enough to pass through with a full armload of wood. The wall was 18 inches thick. It was not a wall that moved when you pressed against it. It was not a wall that wobbled or settled or shifted. It was a wall built by someone who had grown up watching a man press his palm against every joint before calling the job done, and who had applied that standard to every stone in every course from the first to the last. On the 5th night, the wall was finished. Cora lay on her bedroll on the bare stone floor behind the finished wall. No fire and no light in the October cold that had come down off the ridge and settled into the ground, the way cold settles into limestone, which is slowly and completely and without mercy. The wall was done, but nothing else was. No floor, no shelves, no hearth, no chimney, no warmth except what her own body generated inside the bedroll, which was not enough, in which the limestone beneath her drew away as fast as she could make it. She lay there in the dark, and for the first time since Douglas Hargrove had told her the marriage had not taken, Cora cried. Not because she missed the Hargrove house. The Hargrove house had never been home, and she understood that now with the clarity that cold stone and honest darkness tend to produce. Not because she was afraid. She had been too deliberate to be afraid, had planned too carefully, had calculated too precisely. She cried because she was 28 years old, lying in a limestone ravine in the Missouri hills, and the only things in the world that belonged to her entirely were an adze, a horse $41, and the ability to sew a straight seam. She cried because Nell Briggs had been right, and Cora had walked away from the only person who had told her the truth, and now she was alone in a way that made 4 years of loneliness inside a household look like a crowded room. She cried because the limestone ceiling above her was solid and ancient and indifferent. And indifference, when you are lying on cold stone in October with no fire and no name on any deed within 800 feet, feels exactly like contempt. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she stopped. Not because she felt better. because 10 minutes was all she allowed herself. She had learned inside the Hargrove house that grief has no natural limit of its own. If you do not set the limit yourself, it will take everything. And Cora did not have everything to give. She had work to do in the morning. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She lay back down on the bedroll. She thought about the clay bank she would begin shaping with the adze when the light came up. She planned the angle of the cut and the depth of the shelves she would carve into the face and the position of the firebox recess in the back wall where the clay would be thickest and the heat would hold longest. She thought about these things with the focused attention of a woman who has understood on a cold stone floor in the dark that the difference between surviving and drowning is not strength. It is occupation. It is having the next thing already planned before the current thing is done. She closed her eyes. Outside, the October Creek ran low and cold over pale limestone. Above the rim, the Hargrove land lay quiet under its first frost. The kitchen garden she had built from nothing was in its last good week before the hard freeze would come down and end the season, and no one in the farmhouse had gone out to harvest the last of it. 80 feet away, behind a wall of fitted stone that looked like nothing but the ravine itself, Cora Hex slept. And in the morning, she got up and went back to work. Part 2. The Engineering of Invisibility. She began with the clay. The morning after her first night on the stone floor, Cora rose before the light was fully in the ravine and stood looking at the back wall of the space she had built, which was not yet a space so much as a problem she had enclosed. The wall behind her was natural clay bank, packed and dry from decades of the limestone overhang keeping the rain off it. The floor beneath her was bare stone. The air inside was cold in the way that closed spaces are cold in early October. A still and concentrated cold that does not move the way outdoor cold moves, but simply sits pressing against everything it touches. She looked at the clay bank with the adze in her hand, and she thought about the problem, the way her father had taught her to think about problems, which was by breaking them into their parts and addressing each part in the order that made the most structural sense. The shelves first, then the firebox recess, then the floor. The chimney last, because the chimney was the engineering she would have to think hardest about, and hard thinking required that the other things be already settled. She began cutting. The adze was not designed for clay. It was designed for wood, for shaping and dressing rough timber into finished surface, for the kind of precise removal that leaves a flat face where there was a rough one. But James Hex had kept the blade sharp to a standard that most working tools never achieved, and a truly sharp blade, Cora had learned by watching him, will do work. It was not designed for if the hand guiding it understands what it is asking. She cut the first shelf into the clay bank at shoulder height, 18 inches deep and 3 feet wide, angling the back face slightly upward so that anything stored on it would sit against the wall rather than slide forward. She pressed the cut surface with her palm when it was done. Solid, consistent. The clay held its shape cleanly, the way good clay holds, without crumbling at the edges or softening in the center. She cut 2 more below it, each at a different height, each angled the same way. Then she cut the lantern niches, 2 of them positioned so that a flame niche would throw light into the maximum area of the space without creating a point source visible through the 2-foot gap at the top of the front wall. Then she began the firebox recess. She had thought about this longer than anything else. A fire inside the space was not negotiable. October in the Missouri Ozarks is a month of hard frost and cutting wind, and the limestone floor of the ravine would draw heat from a sleeping body faster than any bedroll could replace it. She needed fire. But fire meant smoke, and smoke rising from a ravine on private land, where no fire should be, was a signal readable from half a mile in clear weather. She could not build a chimney in the conventional sense. Vertical smoke is visible smoke. Visible smoke was the end of everything. She had worked out the solution over the weeks before she left the Hargrove house during the evenings when she sat in the kitchen pretending to mend, while Douglas and Owen talked on the porch, and the window was open, and the sound of their voices told her everything she needed to know about the shape of her future in that house. She had remembered something she had noticed 2 winters before when a section of the Hargrove kitchen floor had been replaced and the workers had opened the wall around the clay chimney to reset a damaged flue. The clay itself, she had observed, retained heat for hours after the fire was banked. She had felt the east wall of that kitchen at midnight with her palm and found it warm to the touch. Not warm like stone that has been sitting in sun, warm like something that had been fed and was giving back what it had been given. Clay holds heat differently than stone. Clay absorbs and releases slowly, patiently over a longer period and at a lower temperature. A clay channel, if long enough and angled correctly, would cool and disperse smoke before it reached the surface. She cut the firebox recess into the back wall 18 inches deep and 3 feet wide, with a flat floor and a curved rear face to reflect heat forward into the room. Then she began the channel, working with the adze in her hands. Both she cut a horizontal passage from the back of the firebox, not rising vertically toward the ceiling, but running laterally into the clay bank, angling slightly upward, 12 feet back into the earth, before turning and beginning its gradual rise toward the surface. The work took 4 days, lying on her side in the narrow cut with the adze handle shortened to fit the space-removing clay in careful increments, and packing the removed material against the lower edges of the channel to shape the angle. 12 feet of horizontal clay passage angled to rise. By the time smoke traveled that distance, it would be cooled and fragmented. By the time it reached the surface, it would be invisible in daylight. In cold weather in the early mornings when mist rose from the creek below, it would be indistinguishable from the natural moisture already in the air. She tested the channel before she finished it, burning a handful of dry leaves in the firebox recess and watching from above at the rim, where the passage emerged through a crack in the limestone behind a screen of burrow oak roots that had been growing along the ravine wall for 60 years. The smoke emerged thin and pale and dispersed immediately into the morning air. From the property road 20 feet away, it was nothing. It was nothing, and it would keep her alive through the winter. She spent $11.20 of her 41 on a small cast iron firebox with a removable grate purchased from the hardware merchant in Greystone on a morning when the store was quiet, paid for in cash, carried back in the horse's saddlebags over 2 trips. The merchant did not ask her name. She did not offer it. This was the first of many transactions she would conduct over the following years, on the principle that the best way to not be found is to give people as little as possible to remember. The floor came last. She had been splitting oak logs from the deadfall along the ravine rim for a week by the time she was ready for it, working in the early mornings and the late afternoons when the light was bad enough above the rim that a rider on the property road would not easily see what she was doing at the bottom of the cut. The trees were already down, brought by the previous winter's ice storms, and the wood was dry. She worked with the adze, slowly choosing accuracy over speed, splitting each piece to a consistent thickness and dressing the top face flat. She laid the first layer directly on leveled clay, the boards running north to south across the full width of the space. Then the second layer running east to west, perpendicular to the first, each piece fitted close against the next, the bark removed and the surfaces smooth from the adze edge drawn flat along the grain. It was the way she had seen subflooring laid, when the Hargrove kitchen floor was replaced, the double layer that distributes weight evenly and resists the movement that single-layer planking develops over time as wood expands and contracts with the seasons. She fitted the planks close, not nailed because she had no nails and no intention of buying any, but close enough that the fit itself provided resistance to movement. She pressed each board into place with the full weight of her body, checking the surface with her eye from the low angle the way a carpenter checks a floor, looking for high points and soft spots and the subtle cant that tells you the leveling is wrong. On the 14th day, the floor was finished. Cora stood in the middle of the space and turned around once. 11 feet deep, 18 feet wide, 8 feet tall, where the limestone overhang met the top of the front wall, dropping to 6.5 at the clay bank. A plank floor over leveled clay over solid limestone. 3 clay-cut shelves, 2 lantern niches, a firebox recess with a flue that ran 12 feet through the earth and emerged behind a screen of roots in a crack in the rock above. A dry stacked limestone front wall with a doorway framed by flat-faced standing stones. A canvas panel hung behind the doorway on wooden pegs she had driven into the clay. She had spent 14 days and $11.20. Everything else she had cut and shaped and fitted from what the ravine provided, from the limestone rubble on the floor and the clay bank behind her and the fallen oak along the rim, and the patience of a woman who had spent 4 years inside a household where her competence was acknowledged and her personhood was not, and who had arrived in a limestone ravine with those things carefully sorted. It was the smallest room she had ever lived in. It was the first space in 28 years of life that belonged to her without anyone's permission, without any deed or name or contract, without the consent of any other person on earth. It was hers because she had made it, and because making it had required everything she knew. And because what you build with everything you know belongs to you in a way that nothing inherited or assigned or granted ever quite can. She moved in on October the 17th, which was a Thursday, which was the day the first hard frost came down off the ridge and turned the last of the roadside asters black and changed the ridge line from green to rust in what felt like a single afternoon. She hung the canvas panel. She laid her bedroll on a platform she built on stone legs 18 inches above the floor, high enough to stay clear of any water that might come through in a heavy rain. She set her sewing kit on the east wall shelf. She installed the cast iron fireboss in its recess. She ran the first fire and went up to the rim above and watched the vent emerge behind the oak roots and disappear into the morning air. And she stood there for a long time looking at nothing, which is what successfully invisible things look like. Then she rode into Greystone, tied the horse 2 streets from the main road, and walked to the dry goods store. Earl Voss ran the dry goods store on the main street of Greystone from behind a counter that smelled of flour dust and lamp oil in the particular stillness of a man who had decided a long time ago that most human speech was a waste of breath and had organized his life accordingly. He was about 50. He had buried his first wife 12 years earlier. He had married Dorothy 3 years after that, and the two of them lived behind the store in rooms that Earl kept as neat and spare as his sentences. People who did not know Earl Voss thought he was slow. People who knew him understood that Earl simply found most conversation to be noise, pretending to be meaning, and that when he did speak, he meant exactly what he said and nothing more and nothing less. This quality made him either the most honest man in Greystone or the most unsettling, depending on how comfortable you were with silence. Cora walked in on a Tuesday morning in late October. She stood at the counter. Earl looked up from his ledger with the flat gray eyes of a man who is waiting to understand whether this visitor is going to require effort. She explained the arrangement in plain terms without preamble and without explanation. She would take orders for seamstress work through his counter. Customers would leave fabric and instructions. She would collect every Tuesday. She would return finished work every Friday. Payment would pass through the counter. Earl would not need to know where she lived, where she worked, or what name she used before the one she was using now. Earl looked at her for a long time. His eyes did not blink. The store was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a space where sound goes to be absorbed by bolts of cloth and sacks of grain, and the patience of a man who is never in a hurry. He said, "What do you need from me besides the counter?" Cora said, "Your silence." Earl said, "That I have plenty of." He did not ask another question. Not that day. Not in the years that followed. Cora turned to leave. Earl spoke again to the ledger rather than to her in the tone of a man making a minor administrative note. "I open at 7 on Tuesdays, but I have not finished my coffee before 8, so do not expect conversation before then." Something moved in Cora's chest. A small loosening, the beginning of a sound she had not made in months. A sound that started somewhere below her ribs and rose, and she caught it before it reached her face because she was not yet reacquainted with the sensation of almost laughing, and because the dry goods store on the main street of Greystone was not the place to relearn it. She walked out into the October morning with 3 orders already waiting on the counter behind her and rode north back to the Ravine. The arrangement began immediately. It operated with the mechanical reliability of 2 people who understood each other's terms and saw no reason to renegotiate them. On Tuesdays, Cora arrived at the store in the window between Earl's coffee and his first customer, collected the week's orders, and left. On Friday, she returned the finished work. Payment passed through the counter in both directions, cash in an envelope, no discussion. She was not invisible in Greystone. A woman who appears at a dry goods counter on a fixed schedule is not invisible. But she was unremarkable. She was the seamstress who worked through Voss's counter, and in a town where women organized their domestic economy through exactly this kind of arrangement, she was not anomalous enough to be interesting. People noticed her the way people notice regular things completely in the moment and not at all afterward. This was what she needed, not invisibility, unremarkableness. November came. The creek dropped and steadied. The ravine held its temperature in a way the open hillsides could not. The limestone walls on either side, storing the warmth of whatever pale autumn sun, still reached the bottom of the cut, and releasing it through the nights in a slow and even radiation that Cora could feel against her skin when she pressed her palm to the stone at midnight. She was not warm the way a heated house is warm. She was warm the way a thing is warm when it has been designed to conserve what it has rather than generate what it lacks. The distinction was one she would not have understood a year earlier. She understood it now because she was living inside it. The smell of the ravine in November was something she had not anticipated. Wet oak leaves decomposing along the walls, a rich and heavy scent that reminded her of her father's shop after rain. And underneath that, the clean mineral cold of limestone, the smell of a thing that does not change and does not care whether you notice it or not. Permanent and indifferent. The most honest smell she had ever known. She heard gunshots on certain mornings distant 2 or 3 miles east. Hunters on the ridgelines during November deer season. The sound entered the ravine as a sharp crack distinct from the low groan of a falling tree, and Cora learned to distinguish between the two within the first week. Gunshots meant people. People meant attention. Attention meant the firebox stayed cold until the hunters moved on. She learned the rhythm of the season the way she learned everything in the ravine, by sitting still and paying attention until the pattern revealed itself. Then December came and the rain came with it. Not a storm, a siege. 7 days of continuous water from a sky that looked like wet cement, the kind of rain that does not pause or vary, but simply continues at the same gray intensity until you begin to wonder whether it has always been raining and you simply failed to notice until now. The creek rose. Cora watched it from her plank platform on the first night. The water had been 4 feet wide and 6 inches deep for 2 months. By the second day of rain, it was 8 feet wide and climbing the banks. By the third day, it had crossed the ravine floor and was moving toward the base of her front wall. She sat on the platform with her feet drawn up and watched the black water creep across the planks she had spent 4 days splitting and fitting and smoothing. She calculated as she watched. If the water rose another 12 inches, the floor would lift. Oak planks on wet clay will float when the water reaches a sufficient depth, and once they float, they travel, and once they travel, they are gone. And 2 weeks of the most careful work she had ever done would be in the creek and then in the river, and then nowhere. The water reached the edge of the platform. She could feel the cold of it through the oak. She could hear the creek outside running fast and heavy, a sound that had been a murmur for 2 months and was now a roar, the sound of a thing that has been gentle, discovering that it does not have to be. She did not sleep. She sat on the platform through the night with her back against the clay wall and her knees drawn up, and she watched the water and calculated and planned and waited. The water stopped. It reached the edge of the planks and held there for 6 hours as if considering the next step, and then it began to recede. Slowly, grudgingly, the way something recedes when it has made its point and is satisfied that the point has been received. By morning, the creek was within its banks. The floor was wet but intact. Every plank was where she had laid it. Cora did not stop to feel relief. She climbed down from the platform before the sun was fully in the ravine and began digging a drainage channel along the base of the front wall with the adze cutting into the soft, saturated ground while it was still workable. She lined the channel with limestone rubble and angled it to carry water around the perimeter of the space rather than through it. It took 4 days. She did not rest until it was finished. And she learned something from the flood that she could not have learned any other way, and that no book on farm construction had thought to include. The ravine was not hers. She lived in it and had shaped it to her purposes, but it belonged to the water and the stone and the 60 million years of geology that had carved it, and it would remind her of this fact whenever it chose, and she would either adapt or leave. There was no third option. This was not a lesson she resented. It was a lesson she respected the way her father had taught her to respect a saw, by understanding that the tool does not care about your intentions, only about the angle of the cut. The ravine was the same. It did not care what she had built or how carefully she had built it. It cared only about gravity and water and the properties of limestone. And a person who understood that about a place was safer in it than a person who believed the place belonged to them. She deepened the drainage channel in the spring. She was ready the next time. The winter passed in the rhythms of the work. Tuesday collections, Friday deliveries, sewing by lantern and light in the evenings with the firebox running low and the clay walls warm against her back. The 3 customers from her Hargrove days had been joined by two more through the particular network of women who know where to find good work, and Cora's counter-arrangement at Voss's store had become one of those small institutional facts that Greystone absorbed without examining, like the schedule of the mail rider or the opening hour of the grain exchange. She was earning, she was warm, she was by every measure she could apply more at ease than she had been at any point inside the Hargrove house. This was a fact she shared with no one because there was no one to share it with, and because it would have been difficult to explain to anyone whose understanding of a woman's situation was bounded by the assumption that a woman without a household was a woman without stability. Cora had stability. She had built it herself from limestone rubble and bent oak and the careful application of everything she had ever been taught and everything she had ever noticed. She had not been given it. She had not inherited it. She had earned it in the most literal sense possible with her hands and her attention in 14 days of work in October cold. That made it more stable than anything the Hargroves had ever owned, because the Hargroves had inherited their stability, and what is inherited has not been tested by the person holding it. What has been built knows every weakness in its own foundation. Spring came to the ravine before it came anywhere else. The limestone walls caught the early sun and held it, and the bur oak roots above the doorway put out pale green leaves that filtered the morning light into something soft and shifting. The mint Cora had planted by the creek entrance in April had survived the winter and was already showing new growth at the base green, pushing up through the dead stalks, with the reliable indifference of a plant that does not require encouragement. She had planted the mint for no practical reason. It did not feed her. It did not keep her warm. It contributed nothing to the structural integrity of a limestone shelter in a ravine on someone else's land. But she had wanted to smell it in the morning when she stepped outside, and wanting something for no practical reason was a thing she had not allowed herself in so long that the act of kneeling in the mud and pressing the roots into the damp soil with her fingers had felt almost reckless. This was the moment, though she did not mark it as such at the time, when she shifted from surviving to living. The difference was small. It was the size of 3 mint plants. But it changed the nature of everything that followed, because a person who is only surviving is always ready to leave, and a person who is living plants things. It was in the second autumn November of 1890 that Owen Hargrove came. Cora was inside the space fitting a new section of canvas to the doorway panel, where the previous one had begun to fray at the lower edge when she heard the hoofbeats on the property road above. She did not move immediately. Hoofbeats were not rare. The property road ran along the ravine rim for 600 feet, and riders passed above her with a regularity she had long since catalogued by time of day and frequency. The morning rider was usually a farmhand checking the north pasture. The afternoon rider varied. But this set of hoofbeats was different. She knew Owen's horse by sound. She had heard those particular footfalls on every surface around the Hargrove farm for 4 years, on clay and on gravel and on the packed earth of the barnyard. And she knew them the way you know a sound that has been part of the furniture of your daily life for long enough to become unconscious. She set down the canvas panel. The hoofbeats came along the rim at a slow walk and stopped, directly above her. Cora did not move. The firebox was banked no smoke. The canvas panel was down across the doorway. The front wall was stone against stone, its surface matched as closely as she could manage to the natural limestone of the ravine walls on either side. There was nothing to see from above because she had built it that way, had made every decision from the first stone to the last plank, with the knowledge that the view from the property road above was the view that mattered most. The horse shifted. She heard the small sounds of an animal that is uneasy, the adjustment of weight, the quiet movement of a horse that has sensed something it cannot identify, and is communicating this to a rider who is not paying attention. Owen was not paying attention. She knew this about him. She had known it for 4 years. Owen Hargrove did not look at the things around him with the careful accumulating attention that tells you what a place actually is. He looked at the things he expected to see, and he saw what he expected, and the ravine had always been expected to be nothing, so nothing was what he saw. He had never walked to the bottom, not once in his entire life on land that bore his name. The Hargroves called it the drainage ditch, and they meant it. They had owned the land above the ravine for 2 generations, and not one of them had ever stood at the bottom of the cut and pressed a hand against the east wall and felt what was there. The hoofbeats resumed, slow, moving away. diminishing, gone. Cora remained still for 20 minutes after the sound disappeared. She had expected to feel something, relief perhaps, or the tight, adrenalized residue of a close call. Instead, she felt something quieter and more settled. She felt the particular clarity that comes when a theory you have built a significant portion of your life on is confirmed by direct evidence. She had built this place to be invisible to people who did not look carefully. Owen had ridden directly above it and seen nothing. Not because she had been lucky, because she had been precise. She resumed work on the canvas panel. There was that same autumn a new complication. Willa Dunmore was the wife of the Methodist minister in Greystone, and she believed in community with the absolute conviction of a person who has organized their life around a single principle and defended it so long that it has become indistinguishable from identity. She organized the church sewing circle and visited the sick and brought food to new mothers and did all of this with a warmth that was entirely genuine and a persistence that was entirely relentless, and the combination made her the most effective and the most dangerous woman in Greystone, depending on whether you wanted to be helped. Willa had received a shirt through the Voss counter commissioned by one of her neighbors. She had examined the stitching with the attention of a woman who sewed well enough to recognize work that was better than good. She had turned the shirt inside out and looked at the seam allowances and the buttonhole finishing and the way the collar had been set, and she had understood immediately that whoever had made this shirt had been trained properly and had then spent years refining what they had been taught until the technique became something closer to instinct than craft. She went to the dry goods store and asked Earl directly about the seamstress. Earl said there was nothing to tell. Willa placed an order for a shirt for her husband and said she wanted to meet the seamstress in person to discuss the cut. Earl relayed the request. Cora declined. The shirt was completed and returned through the counter without a meeting, and it was flawless. And Willa Dunmore turned it inside out and examined every seam and decided that she was going to find this woman. She began asking around Greystone, systematically, with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who has organized church suppers and charity drives and who applies the same organizational intelligence to every problem she encounters, including the problem of a skilled seamstress who does not wish to be found. Cora watched this from the bench outside the barber shop across the street, where a woman sitting alone attracted no attention because women sat on benches and men sat in barbershops, and nobody looked twice at either. She watched Willa work the town with the patient efficiency of someone who believed she was doing a kindness, and she understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that the greatest threat to her life in the ravine was not winter or flood or the Hargrove family or even the proximity of the property road above. It was the goodwill of a woman who had decided that a person living alone outside the bounds of community was a person in danger and who intended to rescue that person whether they wanted rescuing or not. Cora had not built 4 walls and a floor and a hidden chimney and a drainage channel to be rescued. She adjusted her Tuesday schedule. She varied her arrival times by intervals irregular enough to prevent pattern recognition. She came to the side entrance of the store rather than the front. She noted which days Willa Dunmore crossed the street toward the dry goods store, and she was not there on those days. Earl said nothing about any of this. He continued to process the orders and the payments with the same flat reliability he brought to every transaction. If he noticed that Cora's schedule had become less predictable, he gave no sign of it. If he had opinions about Willa Dunmore's inquiries, he kept them in the same place. He kept everything he thought but did not say, which was somewhere behind his gray eyes, where they could not be easily retrieved by people who had not been invited to look. And then one Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1890, Cora came to the counter and found beside the week's orders a small package wrapped in brown paper. She looked at it. Earl was behind the counter with his ledger open and did not look up. She opened the package. Inside were 3 sewing needles, size 9, fine gauge, the kind used for leatherwork and heavy canvas. Cora looked at Earl. Earl looked at her with the flat gray expression he brought to every transaction. He said, "You have been using 7s for heavy fabric. I can tell from the stitch spacing in your last 3 orders. 9s will hold better on hide." She stared at him. Earl Voss, who had spoken fewer total words to Cora in a year of Tuesday mornings, Then most men spoke in an afternoon had been examining her work with enough attention to identify her needle gauge from the finished product. She said, "How much?" He said, "No charge." She said, "I pay for everything I receive." He said, "Then consider it payment for the flour sack you restitched for me last month without charging." Cora did not remember restitching any flour sack. She was fairly certain Earl had invented the debt on the spot the way a man invents a reason to do something kind, when kindness without justification makes him uncomfortable. She took the needles. They were the right needles and she needed them. And this was how Earl Voss said, "I am paying attention to you without having to say it in words." And Cora understood this because she had spent 4 years inside a household where the difference between being noticed and being valued was the difference between everything and nothing, and she knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of that line. She rode back to the ravine with the needles in her coat pocket and a feeling in her chest that took her until evening, sitting on the platform with the firebox low and the ravine walls going gold in the autumn light to identify. It was the feeling of being known, not fully, not deeply, but enough. Someone had paid attention to the details of her work, and in paying attention to her work had paid attention to her, and had done so without asking for anything in return, and without making it into something she was obligated to receive gracefully or acknowledge formally. She had not been known in even this small way since she had left her father's house. She put the needles on the east shelf next to her sewing kit. She lit the firebox. The clay walls began their slow work of absorbing and holding the warmth, and outside the creek moved in its shallow autumn channel below the ravine floor, and above the rim the Hargrove land lay quiet in the first cold of a second November, that Cora was spending 80 feet from the property line without anyone in the farmhouse knowing she was there. She threaded a number 9 needle in the lantern light and picked up the unfinished order in her lap and went back to work. The autumn of 1891 brought the surveyors. Owen Hargrove had sold the land to a grain merchant from St. Louis named Pershing, who had bought 3 other river bottom properties that season, and who had no particular interest in the north edge of the property or the ravine that ran along the north boundary. The survey crew walked the field boundaries and the creek line and noted the ravine as non-arable drainage in their records, and did not go down into it because the chain was for measuring productive land and the ravine was not productive land. But before the sale was finalized, Douglas Hargrove came to walk his land one last time. Cora did not know he was coming. She had no way to know. She heard the sound of his approach before she understood what it was, a tapping irregular and slow, the rhythm of a man whose body no longer moves at the speed his mind demands. A cane on stone, coming along the rim. She was inside the space and she heard the tapping come toward her along the rim road and slow and stop, directly above. She pressed herself back against the clay wall. The firebox was cold. She had let it go out that morning to air the space. No smoke, no smell. She could hear in the silence after the tapping stop the labored breathing of an old man who had climbed a slope he should not have climbed because there was something at the top of it he needed to see one final time. Douglas Hargrove was 67 years old and selling the land his father had given him, and his father's father had broken from raw ground, and he was standing at the rim of the drainage ditch looking down into it for what was probably the first time in his life. Cora counted his breathing, slow and effortful. The breathing of a body that is carrying more weight than it was built for, not just the physical weight, but the specific heaviness of a man who has based his entire understanding of himself on a thing he is in the process of losing. She heard him settle. Not walk away, settle. The sound of a person lowering themselves to sitting the scrape of boot leather on stone, and then the quieter sound of stillness. He sat down on the rim of the ravine. And then Cora heard the one sound she had not prepared herself for. He was crying, not loudly, not with the full-throated abandon of grief expressed for an audience. Quietly. The way men cry when they believe no one can hear them, in the compressed and private way of a person who has spent a lifetime insisting that nothing is unbearable, and who is alone for the first time with the evidence that something is. Douglas Hargrove sat on the edge of the ravine that ran through his land, the land he was in the process of signing over to a grain merchant from St. Louis, and he cried with the contained devastation of a man who has discovered too late that the thing he valued above all else cannot tell the difference between being owned and being loved. Cora stood against the clay wall in the space she had built beneath his feet, and she listened. She waited for what she expected to feel. She waited for the satisfaction of a person who has been wronged and is watching the person who wronged them receive their consequence. She waited for the clean, hard pleasure of justice arriving in recognizable form. It did not come. What came instead was nothing, a complete and genuine absence of feeling. She stood in the cool, clay-smelling air of her own room, and she listened to Douglas Hargrove cry on her roof, and she felt exactly what she had felt watching Owen ride away on the property road the previous year. Nothing at all. Not triumph, not sympathy, not anger, not relief. Just the sound of the creek below, the weight of the limestone above, the slight smell of cold ash from the firebox. She understood standing there in that absence that this was the truest form of freedom she had achieved. Not the wall, not the chimney, not the plank floor or the clay shelves or the $41 that had become more than $41 through 2 years of Tuesday mornings and Friday afternoons. The freedom was this, that the man who had sat at a kitchen table and dismissed 4 years of her life in 7 words could sit on the roof of her house and weep, and she could listen, and she could feel nothing, and the nothing was not emptiness. The nothing was completion. The tapping resumed after a while, slow moving away from the rim. The breathing grew quieter as it retreated. And then there was only the sound of the creek and the wind in the oak roots above the doorway and the complete ordinary silence of a ravine in the Missouri hills in autumn. Cora stood in the middle of her room. She pressed her palm flat against the clay wall and felt the warmth that 14 months of fire had built into it, the slow, deep warmth of earth that has been patiently and consistently fed. She felt it for a long moment, the way her father had taught her to feel a wall. Solid, completely solid. She lit the firebox. She put water on for tea. She took the week's orders from the shelf and spread them on the platform and began to calculate the yardage she would need for the first of them. Outside, the creek ran low and clear in its autumn channel. Above the rim, the Hargrove land was already in the process of becoming Pershing land, the name changing on the deed, while the soil beneath it remained exactly what it had always been, indifferent to the names of the people who believed they owned it. 80 feet from the fence line, behind a wall of fitted stone going slowly invisible, under its second coat of lichen, the woman who had built the room in the limestone was threading a number 9 needle in the lantern light and preparing for a winter. She was, for the first time in 4 years, entirely ready for. Part 3. She left when she chose to leave. The news came the way most things came to Cora in the ravine, by accident and by wind. It was a morning in early April of 1892. The kind of Missouri spring morning that cannot quite decide what it intends to be, cold in the shadow and almost warm in the light. The air carrying the smell of creek mud and new growth and the particular freshness of a season that has not yet settled into itself. Cora was checking the bur oak roots above the doorway for winter damage, pressing each root in turn and feeling for the soft give that indicates rot, when she saw the paper caught in the lower tangle of roots near the doorframe. A page from the Greystone Gazette, torn and damp, blown from the property road above and carried down into the ravine by the same north wind that brought the cold mornings and the smell of wood smoke from the farms beyond the ridge. She pulled it free. She stood in the doorway with the morning light coming in pale and thin through the bare branches above, and she read it. The obituary was brief. Earl Voss had died on a Wednesday morning in March behind the counter of his dry goods store, survived by his wife Dorothy. Service held Friday at the Methodist Church. Donations to the Greystone Widows Fund in lieu of flowers. Cora read it twice. Then she sat down on the plank platform inside the doorway with the newspaper scrap in both hands, and she sat there for a long time without moving. She was not crying. She had allocated her tears to one night on a cold stone floor in October of 1889, and she had not reopened that account since, and she did not open it now. But the stillness that settled over her was different from her usual stillness, which was the active stillness of a person listening for danger, assessing, measuring. This was the stillness of a person absorbing something they had not prepared for, which is a different kind of stillness, entirely the kind that has no agenda. Earl Voss had been 50 years old. He had spoken fewer words to Cora over 3 years of Tuesday mornings than most people speak in an afternoon. He had kept her arrangement without once asking what she was doing with her life or why she was living it the way she was living it. He had treated the secret not as something precious and fragile that required careful handling, but as an ordinary fact that happened to be none of his business, which was how the best secrets are kept by people who do not consider them interesting enough to discuss. He had noticed her stitch spacing. He had given her needles and invented a debt to justify the giving, because he was a man who found direct kindness embarrassing and had developed a precise protocol for expressing it at one remove in the language of practical transaction, where it could be offered and received without either party having to acknowledge what had actually passed between them. He had kept a record in his ledger. 2 years of payments to C. Hex, the initial and the last name, only totaling $61 all uncollected since the previous autumn, when Cora had stopped coming to the counter after Willa Dunmore's inquiries had made the Tuesday mornings more exposure than they were worth. He had kept recording the payments as they accrued. He had kept the account open and current in his careful hand in the back pages of the ledger where Dorothy would find them. Dorothy Voss found them 3 days after the funeral, going through Earl's papers with the methodical efficiency of a woman who is using practical tasks to give structure to a grief that has not yet found its shape. She found the payments to C. Hext, and she found the amounts, and she found the pattern, and she did not know what to make of any of it because Earl, who had told her everything she needed to know, and nothing she did not, had not told her this. She placed a notice in the Greystone Gazette. Uncollected funds in the name of C. Hex Seamstress, last known arrangement through Voss Dry Goods. Please contact Dorothy Voss to claim. Dorothy also found the note. It was tucked into the back of the ledger, behind the last page of entries, folded once. Earl's handwriting, small and precise, the penmanship of a man who treated words on paper with the same economy he applied to words spoken aloud. It said, North Ravine, Hargrove Land, do not disturb. Dorothy read it twice. She could not make sense of it. Hargrove Land had been Pershing land for 6 months. Earl had not mentioned any business with either family, and the note did not look like business. It looked like something else, something that Earl had considered important enough to write down and private enough not to explain. She put it in the stove. It caught and curled and was ash in less than 3 seconds, which was approximately the amount of time it had taken Earl to write it, and considerably less than the 2.5 years he had spent honoring what it meant. Cora read the notice about the $61 in the same damp page of the Greystone Gazette that had carried Earl's obituary. She sat with it on the platform, and she did the accounting in her head, which took very little time because she kept her own accounts with a precision that Earl would have recognized and approved of. $61 was hers. It was money she had earned through 2 years of Tuesday mornings and Friday afternoons. Money that Earl had held in the ledger against the day she came to collect it, which was a day she had stopped making possible when Willa Dunmore's searching had made her schedule too visible to maintain. She knew where the dry goods store was. She knew what days Dorothy Voss would be at the counter. She could ride into Greystone on a quiet Tuesday morning and give her name and collect the money, and it would be finished. She sat with this for a long time. To collect $61 was to confirm that she had been in Greystone. To confirm that she had been in Greystone was to confirm that she had not left the county. To confirm that she had not left the county was to become a thing that could be found by people who were currently operating on the assumption that she was in Springfield, or somewhere further, or somewhere irrelevant. $61. She folded the newspaper scrap and placed it on the shelf beside her sewing kit. It was the only piece of paper in the Ravine that was not a work order or an account entry. It was the only piece of paper in the Ravine that she kept because it mattered rather than because it was useful. She left the $61 uncollected. This was the only time in 4.5 years that Cora Hex chose to lose money in order to keep something else. She did not regret it. She had learned over 2.5 years in a limestone ravine a very precise understanding of what things actually cost and what they were actually worth, and the two calculations rarely came to the same number. It was Nell Briggs who put the pieces together. Dorothy Voss mentioned the note to Nell on a Sunday after church in the way that people in small towns mention things that puzzle them to the people they believe might understand, which is often not the people who actually do. Dorothy said she had found a strange note in Earl's handwriting, something about a North Ravine on Hargrove Land, and she had burned it because she could not make sense of it, and Earl was not available to explain. Nell Briggs heard the words North Ravine and felt them settle in her body the way a key settles in a lock with a small, precise movement that changes the state of everything it touches. North Ravine, Hargrove Land. Nell had watched Cora ride north on the last day of October 1889. She had stood on her porch in the morning cold and watched Cora's horse move away from her along the road, not south toward the county line, not east toward Springfield, but north deeper into the Hargrove property toward the tree line and the ravine cut beyond it. She had noted this. She had held the observation for 2.5 years in the way she held most things, tightly and quietly, and with the understanding that not every truth she possessed was a truth that needed to be shared. But now Earl was dead, and his note was ash, and Nell Briggs was the only person alive who could connect the words North Ravine to a woman on a horse riding in the wrong direction on an October morning. She knew. She did not need to search or investigate or assemble evidence. She had been assembling it for 2.5 years without knowing she was assembling it, and Dorothy's 11 words had provided the final piece, and it had all come together not with the drama of a discovery, but with the quiet inevitability of something that was always true being finally seen directly. Cora had not left the county. Cora had been in the ravine for 2.5 years, 80 feet from the Hargrove fence line, and nobody had found her because nobody had looked. And nobody had looked because Cora Hext was the kind of woman who understood that the best hiding place is not the one that is hardest to reach, but the one that no one believes exists. Nell had a choice. She could honor what she had been told 2 years earlier through Earl Voss's counter. I am well. That is all. She could leave this alone the way Earl had left it alone, the way the ravine itself left things alone by existing and not asking questions. Or she could go. Nell Briggs was 57 years old, and her knees had been informing her for 3 winters that the hills of Missouri were no longer a reasonable recreational option, and she had been overruling her knees for 3 winters with the stubborn authority of a woman who has decided that the body's objections are noted but not controlling. She had learned enough about loss in 8 years of living alone on 10 acres without anyone's help to know that the worst kind is the kind you choose when you could have chosen otherwise. She chose to go. On an afternoon in mid-April, Nell Briggs walked to the north boundary of the former Hargrove land and found the ravine path and began to descend. She went slowly. Her knees made their case at every step, a sharp and articulate complaint that she acknowledged and overruled the way she always did. The limestone was slick with spring rain. The oak roots along the east wall served as handholds, and she lowered herself down them 1 step at a time with the careful deliberateness of a woman who knows exactly how long she would lie at the bottom if she fell, and has calculated that this is an unacceptable outcome. When she reached the floor of the ravine, she stood still and let her breathing settle. She looked at what was in front of her. The wall, 18 feet of dry stacked limestone running across the opening beneath the overhang, fitted so precisely that the first thing Nell thought was not that someone had built it, but that the ravine itself had grown it the way limestone grows, slowly and through pressure and without anyone's permission. Then she looked more carefully and saw the doorway framed by 2 flat-faced stones set on end, and the gap at the top where the wall met the rock ceiling and the dark rectangle of the canvas panel behind the standing stones, and she understood that she was looking at something a human being had made. She stood at the bottom of the ravine, and she looked at the wall for a long time. It was not the construction she was looking at, though the construction was remarkable in its own right. It was the intention behind it, the deliberate precision, the way every stone had been chosen not only for its structural quality, but for its resemblance to the ravine around it, the way the whole thing had been built to be seen and to be dismissed, the way genuine invisibility is always achieved not by hiding, but by looking like what is expected to be there. No man on Hargrove land would build in this ravine. No man on Hargrove land had ever walked to the bottom of it. Whatever was behind that wall had been built by someone the Hargroves had not considered capable of building, which meant it had been built by someone the Hargroves had not considered at all. Nell called out, "Cora!" The creek ran past. The oak roots above the doorway shifted in the wind that came down the ravine from the north. She called again, "Child, I know you are here. I have not told anyone. I only want to know that you are alive." The canvas panel moved. Cora Hex stood in the doorway of the space she had built and looked at the first person to stand in this ravine and see what she had done. 2.5 years. She had not had a visitor. She had not had a witness. She had built and repaired and shaped and lived and done all of it without anyone seeing it or acknowledging it or knowing it existed. And now Nell Briggs was standing in the creek bed in her church shoes with spring mud on her hem, looking at Cora with an expression that was not pity and was not amazement and was not the particular uncomfortable brightness of a person who is about to say, "I knew it all along." It was something simpler and more serious than any of those things. It was the expression of a woman looking at something that has earned its right to be looked at. Nell stepped forward. She looked past Cora into the space. The plank floor, the clay shelves, the firebox in its recess, the lantern on its niche throwing warm light across the far wall, the morning light coming through the gap at the top of the front wall in a bright band that fell across the floorboards like something painted there by a deliberate hand. Nell said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You built all of this." It was not a question. It did not need to be. Cora stepped aside. Nell entered. She moved through the space with the slow, careful attention of a woman who is not appraising the construction, but the person who did the constructing, reading the room, the way a perceptive person reads a room, not for what is in it, but for what it says about the mind that arranged it. She sat on the plank platform. She looked at the clay shelves and their neat rows of supplies. She looked at the account book on the upper shelf, the composition book, and with its precise columns of income and expenditure, every penny recorded in Cora's careful hand. She looked at the newspaper scrap beside the sewing kit, the only non-functional piece of paper in the space which she understood without needing to be told was Earl's obituary. Cora put water on the firebox. She made tea from the dried mint she had harvested the previous autumn, the mint she had planted by the creek entrance for no practical reason, and which had survived 2 winters and was currently producing its 3rd spring's growth outside the doorway without requiring anyone's intervention. She poured the tea into 2 tin cups and handed one to Nell and sat beside her on the platform. They drank in silence. The creek outside, the wind in the oak roots, the limestone ceiling above them, solid and ancient and indifferent and older than anything either woman could name. After a while, Nell said, "How long do you intend to stay?" Cora said, "Until I am finished." Nell said, "Finished with what?" Cora thought about this. She thought about it honestly and without rushing, because the question deserved that, and because she had learned in 2.5 years of living alone in a limestone ravine that honest answers to important questions are rarely fast. The important ones need to be felt before they can be said. Then she said, "I do not know yet, but I will know when it is time." Nell looked at her, not with skepticism, with the level, straight-on attention of a woman who has spent 57 years developing a very precise instrument for detecting whether a person knows themselves and who has applied that instrument to Cora's answer and found it accurate. She nodded. Then Nell set down her cup and stood up slowly with the full protest of her knees noted and overruled. She walked to the doorway and turned back. She said, "I will not come back unless you ask me to. But if you need anything, you know where my house is." She said one more thing quietly, almost as an afterthought, though Cora would understand later that it was anything but. "I saw the smoke from the knothole last January, the thin kind coming through the limestone crack behind the oak roots. I did not tell anyone." She had known since January. She had watched the thin cold weather haze rise from the rock above and recognized it for what it was, and she had kept it the way she kept everything quietly and completely, without being asked to. She climbed out of the ravine slowly and with effort, holding the oak roots for balance, not looking back. And Cora stood in the doorway of her room and watched Nell Briggs ascend the east wall one careful step at a time and felt the weight of what had just happened settle around her like the clay walls settle warmth slowly and evenly and without announcement. Someone had known where she was. Someone had known and had kept it, not because they had been asked, because they understood that some knowledge belongs to the person it concerns and that the highest form of loyalty is the refusal to use what you know in ways the other person has not chosen. Earl had known this about loyalty. So had Nell. Cora went back inside and finished the week's orders. The spring of 1892 moved into summer and summer into the final autumn, and the ravine moved through its seasons with the same indifference to human arrangements that it had maintained through every season Cora had spent inside it. The creek rose and fell. The oak roots above the doorway leafed out and dropped their leaves and leafed out again. The mint by the entrance grew and was harvested and grew back without being asked to the way useful and persistent things always do. Willa Dunmore had not given up. This was the thing about Willa that Cora had understood from the beginning and had never stopped respecting, even as she organized her life to prevent Willa from succeeding. Willa Dunmore was not a careless woman. She was not a woman who lost interest or decided that a problem was someone else's. She had the particular tenacity of the genuinely well-intentioned, which is sometimes the most difficult kind of tenacity to outmaneuver, because it does not contain the weakness of self-interest and cannot be deflected by making it inconvenient. She had spoken with Dorothy Voss. Dorothy had mentioned the uncollected payments, the letter from Cora's sister in Springfield that had sat at the counter through the winter, uncollected, the curious note Earl had written, and that Dorothy had burned. Willa had another piece. She had been assembling her picture for 18 months, and it was very nearly complete. She began walking the roads around the former Hargrove property on Sunday afternoons. She told her husband she was taking the air. She walked past the north fence line. She walked along the top of the ravine and looked down into it. She saw limestone. She saw creek water. She saw oak roots and the natural rubble of a drainage cut that had been eroding for longer than the town had existed. She did not see a wall or a door or a plank floor or the thin morning haze of a hidden flue because Cora had not lit the firebox during daylight in months, and the wall was stone on stone, gone slowly invisible under 2 years of lichen, and the ravine was exactly what Walter Crane's survey had said it was non-arable drainage, unremarkable, and not worth examining. But Willa talked to Nell. This was the moment that required the most of Nell Briggs, and Nell Briggs met it the way she met everything, directly and without flinching. Willa came to Nell's house on a Thursday afternoon in October, sat at Nell's kitchen table and asked about Cora Hext. She was not accusatory. She was not suspicious of Nell in particular. She was simply assembling the picture the way she assembled everything, by talking to the people most likely to have pieces of it. Nell looked at Willa Dunmore across the kitchen table and told her the first deliberate lie she had told in 8 years. She said Cora Hext had gone to Springfield, to her sister, a long time ago. Willa asked how Nell knew. Nell said she had received a message. This was true in the narrowest technical sense. She had received a message through Earl Voss's counter 2 years earlier. The message had contained 4 words, "I am well, and that is all." Neither of those words was Springfield, but a lie that contains a fragment of truth is the most durable kind, because the person hearing it can feel the truth inside it and assumes the rest is the same. Willa believed her, or chose to believe her, which amounts to the same thing when the alternative is to call a 57-year-old widow a liar to her face in the widow's own kitchen over tea. She thanked Nell for the information. She went home. She stopped walking the roads on Sundays. Nell sat alone in her kitchen after Willa left and felt the lie settle in her chest the way wrong things settle, with a heaviness that is less pain than wrongness, a fundamental misalignment between what has been said and what is. She had not lied in 8 years. She had survived those 8 years partly by refusing to, because the alternative to honesty when you are alone is a certain kind of hollowness that Nell had watched happen to other women and had decided was a price she would not pay. But she had lied for Cora. She had lied not to protect herself, but to protect a woman who had asked for one thing and who deserved to receive it. She made her peace with this. Not quickly and not by deciding the lie had been the right thing in any clean sense, but by accepting that the world sometimes presents situations in which all the available choices have a cost, and that wisdom is not the ability to find the choice that costs nothing, but the ability to decide clearly which cost you are prepared to pay and why. She had paid the cost she could live with. Outside the former Hargrove land lay quiet in the October afternoon. Somewhere below the north tree line, behind a wall of fitted stone that looked like nothing but the ravine itself, a woman was threading a needle by lantern light and preparing for what would be her last winter in the limestone. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was the coldest of the 4 Cora spent in the ravine. The temperature outside dropped below freezing in November and stayed there through December and January, with the implacable consistency of a Missouri winter that has decided not to negotiate. The creek dropped to its lowest winter level and ran slow and glassy between its ice-edged banks, and the ravine walls did their work with the same patient efficiency they had maintained through every previous winter, absorbing what warmth the short pale days produced and releasing it through the long dark nights in the slow, even radiation that made the space livable when nothing else would have been. Cora moved through the space with the ease of someone who has lived in a place long enough that the living has become unconscious. She knew every surface by touch. She knew the exact spot on the east clay wall where the flue channel passed closest to the surface, a patch at shoulder height that was always the warmest point in the room. The place she pressed her hand on the coldest mornings when she needed to confirm that the fire she had banked the night before was still doing its quiet work inside the earth. She knew the sound the creek made at every water level from the summer murmur to the spring rush, and she could estimate the depth within 2 inches by ear alone from inside the space without opening the canvas panel or looking out. She knew which direction the wind was coming from by the sound it made in the oak roots above the doorway, the low note for north wind, the higher sound for west, the intermittent and irregular sound of east wind coming down the ravine in gusts. This knowledge had been built slowly and without intention, the way all real knowledge is built by repeated exposure and attention and the slow accumulation of pattern recognition over enough time that pattern becomes instinct. It was the same knowledge she had built about the Hargrove land in the second year of her marriage, the same carpenter's attention to the actual properties of actual things, but different in one essential way. On the Hargrove land, her knowledge had benefited people who did not value the person who had developed it. Here it benefited no one but herself. And that difference, which she had been aware of since the 14th day, when she stood in the middle of the finished space and turned around once, had not diminished in 4.5 years. If anything, it had become clearer. The way the meaning of something becomes clearer. The longer you live with it, the way you understand a room differently after 10 years of sleeping in it than you understood it the first morning you woke up inside its walls. She had built this, every inch of it, every fitted stone and shaped shelf and smooth plank and hidden channel. She had built it with an adze that had belonged to her father and the knowledge she had absorbed from watching him work and $41 that the Hargroves had not known about, because she had been careful enough not to tell them, and the willingness to sleep on cold stone on the first night and wake up and make it better. Not by inheritance, not by marriage, not by the approval of any person who believed that land was blood and blood was ownership, and ownership was the only kind of value that mattered. She had earned it the way a carpenter earns the right to call a joint finished by testing every part of it under real conditions and finding that it held. And then on a night in January, when the temperature outside was well below freezing, and the temperature inside was comfortable, and the gap between those two numbers was the direct result of every decision she had made in 4 years and 5 months, Cora sat on the edge of the plank platform and understood something she had not expected to understand. She was finished. The understanding arrived not as a revelation, not as an epiphany with clean edges and a clear beginning. It arrived the way dawn arrives gradually and from all directions at once, and then without any single definitive moment completely. She was finished. Not because the ravine had failed her, because it had succeeded. It had taught her everything it had to teach. That she could build, that she could survive a Missouri winter in a self-made limestone room, that she could be solvent and warm and free and entirely unknown at the same time, that she could lose the only person who knew where she was and continue, that she could be found by someone she trusted and choose still to stay until she was ready to go. The ravine had been a school of the most practical kind, and she had completed the course of study, and what remained if she stayed longer was not living, but a kind of repetition that had no more to teach, which was the one thing Cora Hext had always recognized as a signal to move on. Her father had taught her this too, not in words but in practice, in the way he would finish a job and stand back and look at it, and then pick up his tools and go without lingering and without the false sentiment of a person who confuses leaving with loss. She had been here long enough. She had built what she needed to build and learned what she needed to learn and earned what she needed to earn. It was time to carry it somewhere else. She sat with this understanding through January and February, turning it in her hands the way you turn a finished piece of work in the light to check for flaws, testing it from every angle, making sure it was what it felt like, and not a seasonal restlessness or a response to the cold or the aftermath of grief at Earl's absence. She was thorough about this because she had learned from the Hargrove house that the difference between leaving at the right time and leaving at the wrong time is the difference between freedom and flight, and she had spent 4.5 years building her way toward the first of those, and she wasn't going to mistake it for the second. By February, she was certain. She stood in the doorway one morning, looking out at the creek in its narrow winter channel, the water clear and low and very cold, and she felt the certainty settle into place with the same quiet solidity she had felt pressing her palm against the clay bank the first time and understanding that what was behind her was solid. This was solid, the decision, the readiness. She had been waiting for it, and now it had come, and she recognized it because it felt exactly like the moment before picking up a tool, the moment when you know what you are going to do, and you know you are capable of doing it, and all that remains is to begin. March came, the last March. Cora took down the canvas panel on a Thursday morning when the frost was still on the ravine floor, and the early light was coming in pale through the gap above the front wall, and falling in a cold, clean band across the plank floor she had spent 4 days fitting and smoothing in the autumn of 1889. She looked at the space one last time with the particular attention of someone who was memorizing rather than simply seeing, pressing the whole room into the part of memory that keeps things in their physical and sensory detail. The smell of the clay walls and the cold stone and the faint, sweet mineral smell of the limestone ceiling, the sound of the creek in its late winter channel below, the way the morning light moved across the floor in the angle specific to March. Different from the October light that had been there when she first stood in this place and understood what it could be. She packed her things. This did not take long. She had never accumulated more than she could carry, which was a discipline she had maintained not as an ideology, but as a practical constraint that had become over time a way of understanding what she actually needed as distinct from what she had been told she should want. The sewing kit. The composition account book, with its 4.5 years of meticulous records, $112 in the lining of the coat she had sewn herself from canvases, bought at the Greystone hardware store, lined with wool she had traded for in a transaction so quiet and indirect that the other party had not learned the name of the woman she was dealing with. The ads. She had maintained it through 4.5 years with the obsessive care of someone who understands that a good tool is not a possession, but a relationship, and the relationship requires consistent attention from both parties. The blade was sharper than the day her father had handed it to her in the oilcloth wrapping. It was sharper because it had been used properly and regularly, which is the only thing that separates a tool kept sharp from a tool kept merely clean. She left everything else. The plank floor smooth and level, and still precisely fitted every board where she had placed it in October of 1889. The clay shelves with their slightly upward angled backs, holding the shape she had cut into them in 3 careful sessions with the ads. The firebox in its recess with the grate clean and the ash drawer empty, because she had not left ash in the drawer since the first week when she understood that cold ash is one of the smells that does not belong in a limestone ravine and that belongs to a fire that has been maintained regularly, which is to say to a fire that someone is living beside. The limestone front wall, 18 inches thick, dry stacked, without mortar, held by nothing but gravity and the precision of the judgment that had chosen every stone. It had not moved a 1/4 inch in 4.5 years of frost and thaw and the spring lurch of ground that has been soaked through and refrozen and soaked again. It had not shifted because she had not allowed stones that would shift. It had not cracked because she had not built in the places where cracks occur in dry stack work, the places where 2 faces meet at angles that concentrate load rather than distribute it. It was a good wall. It would stand without her. She hid the composition book in the small recess she had cut into the claybank behind the firebox months earlier, a space just large enough for the book and sealed with a flat piece of limestone fitted into the opening and mortared with clay. The book contained every penny she had earned and spent in 4.5 years in columns precise enough that a person reading them could reconstruct the entire economy of her time in the ravine. Every order, every payment, every cost, every calculation. She sealed it in because it was hers and because leaving it behind was a way of saying something she had no one to say directly, that she had been here and had built here and had lived here and had kept accounts here and had left of her own will on a morning in March when she was ready and not a day before. She stood in the doorway one last time. The creek was running low and clear in its March channel. The mint by the entrance had survived its 3rd winter and was already showing green at the base, new growth pushing up through the dead stalks of the previous year with the reliable indifference of a plant that does not require anyone's attention to continue being what it is. She had planted it for no reason other than wanting, and it had thrived for no reason she could name, and it would go on thriving after she left because mint does not require a person's presence to justify its existence. She found this more comforting than she expected. She climbed the ravine path for the last time, loaded the saddlebags, mounted the horse, which was older now, but sound its coat good and its step steady. She did not look back down into the ravine, not because the looking would have undone her, but because the goodbye was already done. She had said it the way she had built the room, quietly and without an audience, and the saying was finished before she mounted the horse, and Cora Hex did not confuse leaving with the performance of leaving. She rode to Nell's house. It was early morning, the frost still white on the grass, the March sun coming through the bare trees at the low angle of early spring, carrying more warmth than February sun, but less than it promised, the kind of March morning that offers something without specifying what. Cora tied the horse at Nell's gate and walked to the porch and knocked. Nell opened the door. She was wearing a house dress, and her hair was down, and she looked at Cora standing on the porch with the saddlebags full, and the adze in its oilcloth wrapping strapped across the back, and she looked at her with the same direct, unapologetic attention she had turned on Cora the first time they had spoken. 9 years ago now, when she had sat on a porch in that fourth summer and said, "You should start thinking about what comes next." Cora said, "I am leaving." Nell looked at her. She did not ask where. She did not ask when she would return. She understood that some departures are not invitations for conversation, but completions of something, and that the appropriate response to a completion is acknowledgement, not amendment. She said, "Are you finished?" Cora considered this the way she had considered Nell's question in the ravine 7 months earlier, honestly and without rushing, because the question was real and deserved a real answer. She said, "I am." Nell nodded. Then she said the thing she had come out to say, the thing that had been waiting in her since October of 1889, the final piece of information she had been holding against this specific moment, because she understood better than most people understood anything, that the right time to say a true thing is when the person hearing it is ready to receive it as what it is rather than as what it hurts. "The kitchen garden," Nell said, "at the Hargrove place. The new family never planted it. It died the first winter after you left." Cora stood on the porch in the early March light and did not speak. She thought about the garden, about the 4 year of composting and clearing and mapping sunlight across the beds through every season and planting accordingly, and knowing which beds needed drainage and which needed shade and which needed the particular combination of clay and loam that she had spent 2 winters building into the soil from nothing. She thought about Douglas Hargrove walking past on an August afternoon and saying, "This one knows how to work," in a voice that made the distinction between praising the work and praising the worker perfectly clear. She thought about the 7 words. The garden is on Hargrove land. And now the garden was weeds and hard clay and nothing worth having, because the land that Douglas Hargrove had valued above the woman who tended it had reverted without her knowledge or consent or attention to exactly what land becomes when no one knows it well enough to care for it. It was not a lesson. It was not a vindication. It was simply the truth of the thing stated plainly, which was the only way Nell Briggs had ever known how to state anything. Cora looked at Nell for a moment. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that was not already perfectly expressed by the silence between them, which was the kind of silence that two people share when they have both understood something completely and do not need to describe it to each other. She turned to the horse. She mounted. She settled the reins in her hands and felt the horse shift its weight beneath her ready. She did not look back at Nell's house. She did not ride past the former Hargrove property for a final view of the fence line, or the tree line, or the rim of the ravine beyond it. She had lived in the ravine for 4 years and 5 months, and she had said goodbye to it before she climbed up, and the goodbye was finished, and she was not going to reopen it for the sake of sentiment. She rode south toward the county line and then east toward Springfield, where her sister Nora lived in a house on a street, and where the spring would be beginning the same way it was beginning in Greystone, with frost on the grass and bare trees, and a March sun that offered more than it had yet delivered. She rode with the adze in its oilcloth wrapping and $112 in her coat, and the knowledge that she could build a home from a crack in the earth and live in it for 4 years and leave when she chose to leave, and not when someone gave her 3 days and a horse and expected her to disappear. In the spring of 1893, Walter Crane wrote his 4 words in his notebook, enclosed it, and climbed back up the ravine wall and went on with his day, and the ravine returned to the silence it had maintained through every season since the limestone was cut by water, older than any name anyone had given to anything in Greystone, Missouri. Willa Dunmore left Greystone in 1904 when her husband accepted a parish in Kansas. She left carrying what she believed was a minor failure, a woman she had tried to help who had simply moved on before the help could reach her. She would carry this her whole life as a small stone. It was not a weight exactly more, an irregularity, the way a stone sits in a shoe present and occasionally felt and never quite forgotten. She never knew that the woman she had spent 18 months searching for had been living less than 3 miles from her house the entire time. She never understood that the thing she called her failure was the thing Cora had worked most carefully to produce. She was a good woman who had directed her goodness toward a person who did not need it directed toward her. And this is a mistake that good people make, and that is very difficult to explain without sounding ungrateful for the goodness. Nell Briggs died in February of 1901 on her 10 acres alone, on a morning when the mist was rising from the creek the way it rose every February morning. Among her belongings, there was no mention of Cora Hext, no reference to the North Ravine, no record of the afternoon she had descended the limestone, cut in her church shoes, and sat on a plank platform and drunk mint tea with a woman who had built a house inside a cliff. Nell understood that some secrets belonged to the person who made them, and she had kept this one the way she kept everything completely and without commentary, and when she died, it went with her in exactly the condition she had received it, intact and unshared and nobody else's business. The ravine is still there, the overhang is still there, the limestone is still limestone, and the creek still runs cold from the springs upstream, and the bur oak roots still thread down through the east wall in pale thick ropes. If you walk down the ravine path today, past the old fence line, past the place where the cut deepens, and the walls rise and the creek narrows, you will find on the east side beneath the overhang a section of fitted stone that does not quite match the surrounding rock. The edges are too deliberate, the faces are too flat, the courses are too even to be geology and too weathered to be recent. Behind the stone, if you look at the right angle in the right light, you can still see the outline of the shelves cut into the clay bank, softened by 100 years of moisture, but still holding the shape a woman gave them with an adze on an October afternoon when she was 28 years old and had nothing but a tool and a plan and the stubborn, unreasonable conviction that she deserved a place to stand. Nobody goes there. Nobody looks. Because Cora Hext did not disappear. She simply did not appear. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a woman who was lost